Welcome, everyone. I'm going to turn this over to Jane Powell, who is the League of Women Voters of the La Crosse Area President, for our introduction.
Welcome to the League of Women Voters February program on environmental justice. I'm Jane Powell, President of the League of Women Voters of the La Crosse area. On behalf of our co-hosting leagues from across the state, thank you for joining us tonight. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan, nonprofit political organization that encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government. We also work to increase understanding of major public policy issues and influence public policy through education and advocacy. We take action on public policy positions established through member study and agreement. As a nonpartisan organization, we do not support or oppose any political party or candidate. The League of Women Voters is an organization committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in principle and in practice. And this program is a direct reflection of that commitment. Robin Schmidt, past president of our La Crosse League, will be introducing speakers in just a minute. But I want to remind you that this program is being recorded and a link will be shared with our co-hosting leagues on their websites for later viewing. If you have questions after the presentation, please type them into the question and answer box on the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat box, however. So thank you, Robin, for bringing us this program, and I'll turn it over to you to introduce our panelists.
Well, thanks, Jane. I'm really excited to introduce our speakers who are going to be sharing with us their perspectives on and expertise on defining, measuring, and achieving environmental justice in our communities. Julie Majerus is the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources first policy advisor whose position is dedicated solely to the work of environmental justice. As the Environmental Justice Policy Advisor for the Secretary's Office, her work includes leading agency-wide initiatives, ensuring alignment of the agency's policy development, and building enhanced community outreach and engagement. Meleesa Johnson is the Executive Director of Wisconsin Greenfire. She received her undergraduate degree from UW Green Bay's Environmental Policy and Planning program, where she served as the Diversity Affairs Coordinator of the Student Government Association. She was named a Morris K. Udall Congressional Scholar for Excellence in National Environmental Policy, and for 2 decades, she worked in county solid waste management, served on numerous boards for waste and recycling, and has worked on environmental justice at the local level. I want to thank both Julie and Meleesa for your time this evening, and we'll let the program get started. Thanks. I think, Julie, you're going to go first.
Yes, thank you so much. Okay, so first I just want to share my screen. So just 1 minute. That's not work. Okay, are you seeing the presentation slides now? Okay, awesome. Okay, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the kind introduction, Jane and Robin. But most importantly, thank you so much to the League for placing an emphasis on environmental justice as a priority. The goals for my presentation today is to review basic environmental justice principles, why environmental justice is important, and then do an overview of my role, which is relatively new here at the DNR, discuss some of the EJ work that's been happening in the DNR over the last year, and discuss together how we might shape environmental justice in our state of Wisconsin. So I'm going to start off the conversation just by noting that environmental justice and the need for equity is, of course, not a new concept. There are multiple resources available where you can learn more about the history of exclusionary practices, as well as the roots of resilience and vibrancy of the environmental justice movement, which began as early as 1968. I'm going to touch a little bit on that history today, but of course there's you can go do a much deeper dive and go deeper into the history, and there's so much more out there to learn. A couple of resources here that I can share afterwards. The EPA's environmental justice website is a great resource for the history. This is a little snapshot of a timeline that they have on that website. That's actually fun to go through. PBS, independent films, recently seems to just continue to produce more and more documentaries related specifically to environmental justice, exploring our history and the impact on decision-making that is happening in present day. So what does environmental justice mean? And more importantly, what does it mean to achieve environmental justice? Today, that's what we're going to look at in my intro, and looking at what that means nationally and in our own state. But really, I like to begin when I do talks both internally that I've been focusing on throughout the agency this year, but also externally with our stakeholders and in this shared conversation about what it means. We really have to begin with the why and the history behind why this is such an important issue. So the need for environmental justice is rooted in the systemic barriers that have led to current inequities. What do we mean by systemic barriers? I'm talking about land use and access in the United States that's really been highly influenced by racism and frankly unethical behavior throughout our history. These have led to disparities in health, socioeconomic success, home ownership, and access to green and blue spaces, all of which stem from historical marginalization and land-based exclusion from healthy environments and generational wealth. This slide and a couple of the next ones provide an overview of and some examples really of specific policies and practices that led to these preclusions. Of course, most of the concepts here are not new information, but it's important to view this history through the lens of its impact on access to land and how that access and our country's practices throughout history have resulted in disproportionate harm and cumulative impacts for historically marginalized communities. An example from the early 1900s, by 1910, African Americans had acquired actually more than 16 million acres of land. This is the most that they would ever own in the United States. Looking at our own state in the early 1900s, as Black communities entered Milwaukee, they entered a segregated housing market. Some of you may have be familiar with racial covenants, which were written into deeds which prevented land or homeowners from selling to Black or other ethnic communities. By 1928, about 50% of white-owned homes in the US had some sort of racially restrictive covenant. In 1948, the law made covenants unenforceable, but they actually continued to prevail through the 50s and 60s. You might be familiar with this because there's communities throughout the United States now that are working to write these out of their covenants, even though, of course, they're not enforceable at all these days. They still exist in some titles, and just because of our work and equity, we don't want to have those remaining there, right? So there's a movement to have those removed. In the 1930s, federal housing agencies redlined Black neighborhoods, locking Black and immigrant families into crowded city centers while helping white communities relocate to suburbs away from industrial zones and air and water pollution. The Federal Housing Authority adopted maps like this one from Milwaukee. The red areas could not get a traditional home mortgage to purchase property. Redlining exacerbated poverty in the Black communities as they were shut out of the wealth accumulation accessed by white families through cheap home loans. Another example is the Urban Relocation Program of 1952. The Bureau of Indian Affairs promised Native families temporary housing and job counseling to lure them to urban areas and away from their homes. Those who moved faced racism and challenges in assimilation, and their move made conditions worse for the communities still living on the reservations, who then lost a significant part of their community all at once. Today, the majority of Native Americans actually live in urban or suburban areas. It's important to remember that injustices continue today. Again, this is just two examples. The US maintains a higher incarceration rate than most developed countries, with significant disparities when it comes to incarceration of people of color. Sadly, in Wisconsin, the ratio of Black residents, for example, to white being incarcerated is almost 12-1, making us the top 3 worst in the country when it comes to incarceration disparity. Looking at communities living in rural areas, not until 1966 did Congress require employers to pay farm workers the federal minimum wage. To this day, farm workers remain excluded from federal overtime requirements, many states' workers' comp laws, and many occupational health and safety protections. So these exclusionary practices inevitably result in poverty and limited access to resources for education, healthcare, childcare, and the basic needs required to help families thrive. So connecting this all to how it becomes an environmental issue, now we have the data to demonstrate what the results of these practices are, and you can see how they've directly resulted in disproportionate environmental harm. So a few data points here. The first 2 in our own state, Wisconsin, lead poisoning rates for African-American children is 4 times that of white children. In a very recent study, Wisconsin was found to be 3rd worst in the country for racial disparities and exposure to harmful air pollution. And then looking at national research now, which there's an abundance of this related to environmental harm. A 2016 study, for example, found a consistent pattern over a 30-year period of placing hazardous waste facilities in neighborhoods where poor people or people of color live. So Meleesa is going to talk more about the impacts on rural communities, because that's very much a part of our environmental justice work here in our state, and the DNR places an emphasis on that as well. Here you have a summary of just some of the impacts specifically on those communities, talking about the limited access to healthcare, and some data points related to environmental harm as well. For example, 10% of private well samples exceed nitrate. In agricultural and rural areas, that's at as high as 20 to 30%. So EPA talks about the cumulative effects of historical marginalization and disproportionate environmental harm. And so they talk about the cumulative effects of multiple environmental harms when it comes to air pollution, proximity to hazardous waste, and so forth. But I like to describe environmental justice as holistic equity, because we're looking at the cumulative impacts on those who are disproportionately impacted in multiple systems. So that's why I talk about disproportionality, not just when it comes to environmental harm, but in these different systems. For example, when you think about individual experiences of different families, for example, a family struggling in the child welfare system is already experiencing trauma, perhaps limited access to healthcare, the mental health resources that they need. When you compound that with limited access to green spaces, which the research now shows is so crucial to mental health and children's well-being, that's just another barrier that they face. You think about students of color living in Wisconsin, where our disproportionality for students of color in Wisconsin is, again, some of the worst in the nation as far as educational outcomes. A student living in Milwaukee who's maybe suffering from asthma and living in that in a polluted area, again, has another barrier just in that they face, compounding their challenges that they're experiencing at school. So now we get closer to formulating the concept of holistic equity for environmental justice and why it's important. It's the interrelation between systems and the importance of those systems working together. And the DNR acknowledges we are part of those systems. When families have limited access to clean air and water, this adds an additional burden that they must overcome in order to not just survive, but thrive. This is a federal definition that I wanted to include. This is a fairly new definition that actually applies to all federal agencies now. This was part of President Biden's executive order this last year's Earth Day that was issued. And it's important that this is a great definition, that it acknowledges not just the how, but the why, and specifically calls out those systemic barriers and goes beyond it goes beyond to explicitly say that all are fully protected from adverse human health and environmental effects. So just wanted to provide that as a resource too. That's a great reference. So moreover, we have heard loud and clear through the feedback and lived experience of some of our most culturally rich, resilient, and diverse communities that there is a need for change and a need to address disparities and achieve environmental justice. So this is important to bring some of that data, some of that history to life in the present, and through the voices of those that we connect with on a daily basis. So to that end, DNR announced my new position on Earth Day 2022, the same day that the governor established the new Office of Environmental Justice at the Department of Administration under Executive Order 161. The development of this position was done in part in response to the calls for prioritizing environmental justice in the governor's task force on climate change report, also DNR's own internal blueprint for climate change, but also, of course, because of the greater focus on environmental justice by EPA and the broader national conversations around equity. The importance of this for our agency is now we have an agency-wide focused position elevating this issue at the leadership level. And I was the first in this position, and I started in November of 2022. So building this new role from the ground up has been focused on how the policy advisor position can leverage agency-wide mobilization for change. This means aligning our work and our policies and practices, systems change and strategic planning. What should our objectives be, and how do we build our capacity, both internally and externally, to do this work effectively? And of course, there's been a strong focus on stakeholder engagement and relationship building, especially with those groups and partners with whom we have not historically been connected. Our work in year one has been focused on answering the question, how can we address known disparities through our program work? And a key part of this is focused on community engagement and relationship building, basically changing history and bringing those voices to the table that have not had a part in decision-making because of those practices of marginalization and exclusion. Our focus on outreach looks at what I've developed as 3 levels of community engagement. So throughout the agency, the work might look differently depending on the program. As some of you are familiar, DNR is huge, and we are distinctive from other states who are doing similar work in that in Wisconsin, DNR includes everything. It includes environmental protection, forestry, fish and wildlife, which is awesome. It's a challenge for us, but it's super cool that we can include all of that in our environmental justice work. So I talk about starting at the ground level, outreach and education. DNR staff are actually awesome at this, and they're awesome even in speaking in plain language. There's so much expertise here, and they're actually really good at explaining some of that technical information. The difference, however, is that we've been doing this outreach and education with only certain groups, or more specifically, there's been certain groups that we haven't reached effectively. So that's a strong focus of our work, is how do we bring that outreach and education to the groups that haven't been involved, and bringing them and meeting them where they're at. The second layer is comprehensively responding to community concerns. So beyond just basic outreach and education, when we have a neighborhood that's specifically concerned about perhaps contamination or pollution in their area, how do we develop ongoing dialogue and really comprehensive communication where they know who to turn to, they understand the issues, they know where they can go for information, and there's a trusted relationship, which is really bringing us to that third level, which is more of a cycle of developing that ongoing dialogue and feedback loop. So really, it should be a cycle that we're providing outreach and education, we're comprehensively responding, and we're in ongoing dialogue so that we know the concerns almost before they have to voice it to us, and we're adapting our services and programs to the needs of the community in response to that input that we're getting. So how have we begun to make some of those changes in the last year? I'm very visual, so I'm just bringing some pictures of what's been happening over the last year to give some examples. here's an example of that first level of expanding our outreach and education with those we've never reached before. So here is a picture from August of 2023, Farm Worker Appreciation Day. I brought some of our staff. There's a captive wildlife administrative warden, as well as an investigator from our environmental enforcement investigative team. We made connections there with some of the service providers for migrant farm workers like DPI and DWD and Family Health La Clinica, some of the advocacy organizations like Legal Action and UMOS, to learn about each other's work and how we can include the needs of farm workers more into the programs and services that we provide. This is an example of that second layer. So while we know at DNR that we need to develop strategies for building our capacity, we've begun to develop models for what more comprehensive, authentic community engagement might look like. I've been working with the remediation development program to test out new ways of communicating with the residents to give them more voice, help us in sharing information, and help us in gaining meaningful feedback to adapt our services. The example pictured here is a neighborhood in Wausau experiencing significant cumulative impacts. And in these pilot programs, it's been incredibly rewarding to see how quickly relationship and trust building has been happening at the ground level. A big focus of my work has been assisting individual programs within the department on determining how they can implement changes to address disparities and cumulative effects on historically marginalized populations. A great example of this is the SCORP, the Statewide Comprehensive Outdoor Recreation Plan. How does that connect with environmental justice? Well, this is a plan that's required by the Park Service for our federal funding. We update the plan every 5 years with initiatives based on data collected regarding how Wisconsinites engage in outdoor recreation. This year, as part of the plan development, we're collecting data we never have before on demographics like race, ethnicity, and disability, also questions related to motivations and barriers to different communities, preventing them from engaging in outdoor recreation. We're also including groups who have never had a seat at the table on the external SCORP Advisory Committee, such as the Urban Ecology Center, the Hmong American Friendship Association, 16th Street Health, and state agencies like DHS and DCF. This is just one example of a program finding ways to operate differently in order to support empowered communities, better share information, and gather meaningful feedback to inform our decision-making. Our agency's goals for 2024 are in large part focused on continuing to build upon our work from last year with a focus on some long-term strategic planning and further deepening our stakeholder relationship building. These are preliminary draft strategies that we've started to identify to achieve our goals. So just sharing those with you, and we're actually in the process of getting both internal and external feedback on this. And again, this is just the beginning of developing strategies. So thank you very much for your time. I'm looking forward to Meleesa's topic and look forward to our discussion and question and answers. Oh, there it is.
All right, and I think I'm going to try and screen share, and we'll see how that goes. I am going to apologize in advance, folks. My 8-year-old grandson, I think, decided to share influenza A with me. It's somewhat unpleasant, and it sounds like I've smoked a pack of Camels and been out all night. I have not done either. So I apologize, and if I need to take a drink of water, it is because of this not fun virus. There we go. And thanks, Julie. I appreciate your rundown on the what environmental justice is, the history. It's fascinating and sad, and unfortunately, I think it's what we've come to expect. That doesn't mean that we can't change it. And I appreciate that the governor and the DNR is working on this issue on a very comprehensive way, because we can't we can't start dismantling those structures unless we have the conversations about those, unless we understand them. I want to talk a little bit about reframing environmental justice, and I'll get to why I'm calling it that in just a minute. It really has, it has to do with some practical conversations that I've had with folks, and I realized that maybe we were being a little too narrow, and if we broaden that, we can actually bring more people into environmental justice and help everybody achieve, good health, good lifestyle, fresh water, clean air, all the things that we expect to have. Oh, and I've been the executive director a little bit less time than Julie's been at DNR. I've been the executive director at Greenfire since November 1st. It's been a whirlwind. So I'm loving the job, and I'll tell you a little bit more about Greenfire in a little bit. Why is framing important to this discussion? I use the word framing a lot because in my private life, I'm fairly politically involved. And I'll leave that aside because we're not talking politics here. I'm also very involved with the League of Women Voters and sit on the legislative committee. And how we frame discussions are always really, really important. George Lakoff talks about framing he's a linguist and he's got a lot of books out, but one of his most important books is Don't Think of an Elephant. So if I tell you, don't think of an elephant, what do? You think of an elephant. So it is how we communicate, and that those unspoken automatic associations that we make in our brains. And we can't help it. We all have our biases. We all know that. Some are explicit, some are implicit. It's just the way our brains have been wired by the experiences of our lives. Now, many of you won't find this surprising, that research has found that human behavior is irrational. Surprise, surprise, surprise. And because human behavior and thought is irrational, we become very susceptible to framing. I had a neighbor once who bought a $400 bike. It was at a garage sale, and it was marked half price. The frame was that he was getting this magical deal, and they had all kinds of, balloons on it. And the guy talked about he and his wife used to take it riding, but she had a stroke and they couldn't do it. It would be good for the relationship of any who bought it. My neighbor bought it, and guess what? He never used it. But the frame was that he was being manipulated. His irrational brain was being told that this was a good thing for him, his marriage, his relationship, his health, everything. So when we think of environmental justice, the frame we often think of, and this isn't good or bad, we often think about poor, low-income neighborhoods, as Julie has already mentioned, adjacent to power plants or chemical plants. The petroleum industry in the South is predominantly in low-income, marginalized communities. This is an appropriate frame. But if we keep this frame constant, we miss the opportunity for understanding the broader frame of what environmental justice is. And the reason it's important, if it's too narrow, if our alley is too narrow, we don't look beyond that. We don't look for other opportunities to make change. How many of you would think about a vibrant Wausau in this conversation about environmental justice? Probably not many, but Wausau has been disproportionately impacted by PFAS. All 6 of their water wells, their service wells for municipal water sources, are contaminated, every single one of them. Unlike Marshfield has one of their service wells is contaminated, and they could shut it down and still supply water to their community. Wausau couldn't. They were disproportionately impacted. Now you're looking at this beautiful picture of the 400 block. I love the 400 block. It's a great place to commune with your friends, go listen to music, enjoy the good food around the square. However, or we wouldn't think about our beautiful Northwoods either, would we? When we think about environmental justice, we wouldn't think about the beautiful lakes and rivers, their beautiful forests. we wouldn't think about them in terms of environmental justice. However, the town of Stella in Oneida County, adjacent to the new Pelican River State Forest, yay, the town of Stella is disproportionately impacted by PFAS. Very small rural community. Now, why I'm talking about this, and I'm going to tie it all together here shortly. So Wisconsin's Greenfire put together Opportunities Now 2.0. This was about PFAS. And thank you, Robin, for all the editing work that you did on this. It was magical. But we have a group called the Contaminants of Emerging Concern, and we've been working on PFAS since 2019. We put out one paper, our 1.0. We had a conference for municipalities to attend, and now we put out the second paper. In the second paper, you'll see that conclusion. Low-income communities, communities of color, and otherwise vulnerable communities may be disproportionately exposed to PFAS. I had to fight to get that in there. And the way it happened was in a conversation with my colleagues, and I think Robin was probably on that call. I said, we need to have something about environmental justice in this document. I'm going to go back to that. We have to have something about environmental justice in this document. And my colleagues, bright, wonderful people, one of them said, well, but this is about drinking water, and Milwaukee and Madison are already served with public drinking water. And so those minority communities, there's not an environmental justice issue for those minority issues when it comes to PFAS. And I'm like, really? Do you have to live in inner Milwaukee or inner Madison to somehow check the box that you now qualify for care under the concept of environmental justice? I said, and not only that, I think I talked about too, they may be serviced with a public drinking water that is being treated to remove some of those PFAS. But if a lead service line is going into their home, as Julie's numbers noted, horribly, African-American Black families are being disproportionately impacted by lead service lines. I had to fight to get this in there. It is in there, but the initial frame, these people weren't, the people on this Contaminants of Emerging Concern are not bad people. Their frame was that it was this narrow scope. Excuse me. I am not going to be able to finish.
Meleesa, if you just want to go through your slides and maybe not have as much discussion,
Yeah.
that might be helpful.
Hang on. We'll have a station break. To give you an idea, Wausau has 2,733 homes that live below poverty. The cost of removing PFAS is $1 million. That frame, to me, means we have to start thinking more broadly about who is being disproportionately impacted by environmental harm. This is a one-time change out, one time. It does not include capital. It does not include operations. Those households living in poverty will now have to bear a bigger burden to ensure that their families are protected. To me, that's an incredible miscarriage of justice. And the folks living in our rural communities, town of Stella, town of Campbell, other places where we have PFAS in the water. Let's say you're living in a rural community and your household income, mom, dad, 2 kids, household income 47,000, maybe 52. let's say it's 60. Got one kid in soccer, another in daycare. Both parents working, you need 2 cars, one car breaks down, and your choices are, I need to get to work, or I'm going to buy a whole house osmosis system. Those are the kind of very, very scary choices that families have to make. So when we think about environmental justice, if we think more broadly, we can think about these families making these terrible decisions about whether to buy a new engine for their car or a whole house osmosis system to keep their family safe. These are the kind of desperate choices that people will have to make. The town of Stella, you've got most of the wells up there, private wells, are desperately contaminated with PFAS. In Portage County, where I live, my dear, dear friends living out in the town of our village of Nelsonville, most wells contaminated with nitrates. Sorry. I am so sorry. I always like to tell people how we can take action. Here's another, and to me, this is an environmental justice issue. If you have only a few bucks to buy some pots and pans, you're going to buy what's cheap. What's cheap is Teflon. As you can see, this fry pan is $32. That family will fry their eggs, fry their hamburgers, and make all kinds of yummy food in that PFAS pan because it's cheap. From an environmental justice, social justice perspective, they don't have a choice. They cannot afford those wonderful made-in stainless pots and pans, which I absolutely love. I feel blessed that I can own them. But not that long ago, a little over 20 years ago, when I was raising my kids in poverty, that PFAS-laden pan was my only choice. Those are the kind of choices that many families have to make from a practical perspective. How can we help? You have a family that's just starting out, maybe a neighbor, friend, family member. Start buying them different pots and pans. I know it seems small, but the amount of PFAS that you're going to accumulate using that PFAS pan over the life of that pan, you will be able to save that family, those kids, those people in that household, that exposure limit. It is, to me, an easy, simple thing to do. And again, if we can only start thinking about our environmental justice framing a little bit more broadly, we start bringing in these other folks, the folks living in our rural communities. Our Hmong families living in our rural or even in our urban areas, they depend on fishing quite a bit as subsistence. They are fishing in contaminated areas just because it's close to them. We may not think about that. We have to start thinking more broadly, because if we don't, the system is too narrow and we miss something. So I'm hoping we can add more things to that brain of ours and make environmental justice a broader perspective to bring in as many people as possible. As the president's executive order said, it's a very, very broad scope, very broad. We don't want anyone disproportionately impacted by the injustices of not caring for our environment. Again, Wisconsin's Greenfire, I should be selling it like crazy, but I can't talk anymore. We are a nonprofit organization. It is an amazing group of some of the smartest people I have ever met in my entire life. It is an honor to work with them. We work on science-based policy and advocate to ensure my grandson, your children, your friends, your neighbors, everybody has a better tomorrow, and our resources are there for them. our goals. We will make it happen. And if you're interested in the organization, there you can find us. We would love to entertain a conversation. I'm done, Robin. I can't talk anymore.
Thank you very much, Meleesa, and I'm so sorry that you're not feeling well, and I'm glad to hear that you're on the road to recovery, even if you're still not sounding the best today. We just really appreciate your joining us, you know, considering how those bugs can go around. So we're gonna have this now open for questions and answers. We do have a few questions that are in the question and answer box. I would ask the audience, if you have questions, please feel free to keep adding to those questions, and we will get to them. I have a couple questions before we get to the ones that are listed here. I have a couple questions that I'd like to ask, and I think Julie, you'll probably be bearing the brunt of most of the response. But my question kind of is a kind of lead into some of the questions that I'm seeing, and that is that how do we affect change at the local level of government when it comes to local decisions? Because zoning, land use, approvals of permits, things like that are very much of a local decision, and they have a huge impact on the communities within their jurisdiction. So I'm just wondering kind of what your thoughts are in terms of bringing that into the conversation at the local level.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the other challenge with some of those local decision makings, especially around zoning and land use, is that there's often multiple agencies involved in those decision making, the permitting. And I think the best thing that local organizations can do is really seek to find where there are considerations that are not being made, right? Inequities that are not typically being considered. So that's one, but then also doing what you can to involve those communities that are not historically at the table, whose voices are not necessarily being heard. And the best way to do that is through partnerships with other local organizations who are providing advocacy or representing specific communities. And it sounds simple, but again, like the examples that we have at DNR, where we've just started one conversation with an organization we've never really connected with before, within 5 minutes, there's so many points of connection, and we're coming up with solutions already. The solutions are going to come from the communities themselves, and the communities who are being disproportionately impacted. They are resilient, they're smart, they know their needs better than anyone else. And so having in-depth conversations with them and working with them to raise their solution, bring their solutions to the forefront, and so that they're part of those conversations at the local level. Yeah.
I just want to add, and you're absolutely right, that grassroots is really good and absolutely essential. Show up at meetings. I know zoning isn't sexy. I love zoning. I'm a weirdo. But show up at your plan commission meetings. Ask questions. And if you don't like the answers, keep asking. Run for office. This is how we affect change at the local level. Not complaining, but engaging. And if you don't understand what the local zoning code is telling you, then show up at the community development office and sit down with the planner and say, please explain it. That kind of community engagement, I guarantee you, will result in change.
So kind of
Yeah, I can add to that too, Robin, because of and that reminded me, Meleesa, I started talking about some of the challenge sometimes is that you have multiple agencies, both at the local and state level, that are playing a role in these decisions. And that can get confusing. And I think the other thing to impart is sometimes those agencies don't realize that it's confusing. So whatever can be done to kind of streamline the communication, maybe bring agencies together, government agencies, to collaborate and coordinate, because they're coordinating their services, but are they coordinating in their communication to the community? And sometimes it just takes a voice like explaining like, hey, this is the information we need. We don't quite understand it. And where should we go for these resources? So whatever is possible to do that kind of better comprehensive communication between agencies, I think is helpful. And some have the capacity to do that, some don't, but you have to at least ask, right?
And I think so the questions that I'm seeing kind of are in the context of a situation in Madison with the adoption of the approval of the F-35 fighters and the fact that the noise and other issues around them is disproportionately impacting those people who live around the airport, which of course, as you would expect, has probably lower land values and less economically advantaged people. And so some of these decisions are kind of done recognizing that they're going to disproportionately impact people of lower economic status, but yet they're still happening. And so I think there's some frustration with how do you somehow change that mindset when you see these kinds of things happening. And I think that I really appreciated Meleesa's comments about, that not only get involved, but, run for office and challenge some of those decision makers to be making better decisions. And I'm wondering if you had any other thoughts about like land use around uses like airports where you do have more of a congregation of lower income just because of the quality of the environment, so to speak.
So we're not starting with softball questions, right? So but this is raising like exactly why environmental justice can be such a challenge. Because it raises really big questions. Like, we talked in the beginning about land use and how it's resulted in some really exclusionary practices in certain communities only being in these disproportionately polluted areas. We can't change that overnight, right? And that's super difficult in how are we going to change some of these practices. And then the question is, obviously we need more low-income housing. Where should that go? Certainly, yes, wherever possible, it should be placed where we have less environmental pollution. And that's on a case-by-case basis, but that's a struggle as well. We need low-income housing. Where can it go? Where do we have land space for it? But absolutely, while in the past inequities were just sort of overlooked, in the present day, when we're more mindful, that needs to be at the forefront of our decision making. And it is continuing to happen everywhere across the nation. For those first three questions too, of course, specific questions about PFAS are beyond my expertise, but it raises questions around, low-income communities, immigrant communities, certainly the fish advisories. That's another area where we have fish advisories. We know that there are communities that subsistence fish. They rely on that fish to feed their families. Are they aware of the fish advisories? And not to mention, of course, the disproportionate impact on water pollution. And can we ensure that the water is clean in the first place? But first, can we just start with making sure that they have the information that they need to make healthy choices for their families? So I know that's a bit of a non-answer, but it's like, yes, we have to develop tools so that equity is at the forefront of those decisions that we're making.
I would say from a land use planning perspective, again, my degree is in planning, and I already said I like zoning, so I've admitted my love of zoning, but we should be looking at not trying to segregate low-income housing into one area. Low-income housing should be a part of a community. And if you look at a book like Strong Towns or Happy Cities, both of which are about urban planning, our urban planning should incorporate mixed income developments. Low-income people don't, just because they're low income, this is another framing. In our minds, all low-income individuals are a monolith. And so, and I get a little sensitive about this because, again, not that long ago, I raised my kids in poverty, high school dropout, didn't graduate from college till I was 45. I know what it's like. We are not a monolith. Being poor doesn't make you the same as other poor people. And we want to try to segregate poor people into one spot. we should be creating zoning, modern zoning, not 1970s zoning, because we're still doing 1970s zoning. I'm going to go on about zoning again. We should be creating new zoning that incorporates mixed incomes in walkable, livable communities. So that's my opinion.
Great, thank you. I'm going to just skip around to some of these questions as we go through here. And Meleesa, just a quick question for you. I think it's a real practical. So what's the best way to dispose of our PFAS cookware that we don't want to use anymore? Does it go into the landfill, or does it, like, what do we do with it?
Yes, we just cycle it through the system. Landfills are amazing, repositories. At one point, when this first started emerging as a huge issue, about 2018-19, and we didn't know what to do. And my folks over at DADCAP, who administer the Clean Sweep program, that's your household hazardous waste program, and many of us in solid waste would implement that through our Clean Sweep or hazardous waste collection programs. And they thought about doing a PFAS contaminated household product collection. And we concluded that we didn't have enough trucks in the state of Wisconsin to transport all that stuff. Unfortunately, it goes to landfills. It's just everywhere. Landfills are designed, our modern landfills are not perfect. However, they are designed to protect human health and the environment through multiple systems. And for now, it is the best system we have.
Here's a question. Thank you, Meleesa. Here's a question about how can let me see how I can take this. So when you're in a community, like, how do you identify, I guess for Julie, how do you identify, like, who are the key representatives of the communities, like, beyond elected officials, and how do you find them? Who are they? And there was also a question about just asking you specifically if you could just kind of share with us some of the organizations you're working with now so that people get a sense of, like, the types of organizations.
Yes, those are both really great questions. And I guess in my discussion, I didn't share that much about my background, but this is part of why I do talk about my background when speaking with external stakeholders, because it does play a role in kind of explaining the new lens through which we're trying to look at DNR. So I've been at DNR for just over a year. I don't come here with an environmental management or protection background or a science background. My background is in public advocacy and social justice. So I began as a public defender for 3 years. That was in practice, I represented both adults as well as children in the child welfare and justice systems. I worked in policy and legislation for the Child Welfare Division of the Department of Children and Families. And then more recently, I was at the Department of Public Instruction, where I ran the migrant education program and also focused on educational stability for students in foster care. I say all that because part of what we're doing at DNR to connect with different organizations is based on my experience and the networks that I've built over time, not just me personally, but because I have this background and are familiar with some of the other state agencies who have networks, some of the local organizations, some of the service organizations who have connections in local communities, because you really need to start with a trusted messenger to whom you have a connection with. And that's the other challenge with doing effective outreach and engagement, is that you can't just simply cold call an organization that's representing Hmong American fishermen, right? And say, hey, we'd like to do some outreach, because especially some of the experience of certain marginalized communities, especially that call coming from a government agency, is not going to be effective. But more importantly, it's not a way to build trust. It wouldn't be a way to build trust with any entity or community, right? So building upon some of the networks that I'm bringing to the agency, but not just like the networks that already exist, but like, how do you build those networks, right? So my experience in doing that sort of systems change and community engagement and relationship building. So to answer the more specific question, some of the groups that we've already connected with, So in Milwaukee, we work with Walnut Way, 16th Street Health, the Urban Ecology Center. These are some of the groups that actually we had some touch points on in the past, but we're really starting to build our relationship there. In Wausau, the Hmong American, the Hmong and Hispanic Communications Network that's affiliated with the Medical College of Wisconsin, and WIPS, the Wisconsin Institute for Public and Policy Service, is doing a lot of amazing work, not just in Wausau, but in 8 counties in central Wisconsin, with both the Hmong communities, the Hispanic communities, as well as rural communities through the Rural Resiliency Network. And so we're just slowly building those relationships across the state. In the Appleton area, Longvu and the Hmong, New Hmong Professionals. Inclusion in the Outdoors is a new group based in Appleton as well. We've made some significant connections with New North and their new DEI specialist, Juan Corpus, who New North will now be a fiscal agent for us to actualize a community advocacy coalition for the Green Bay area of concern. So just slowly building relationships, and usually through those relationships, you're able to build further. So to answer the question of like how, again, start with the first trusted messenger, right? So and look at your community. Usually there are organizations within almost any local community that's representing different groups. So just starting to talk about it, go to the public library, go to the places that serve communities that are often marginalized, the shelters, the talk, and you know who will always know it is your local either county health department or even human services like child welfare agencies. They know those groups because they need to. So that's a good place to start as well. But again, going through them, not just immediately trying to reach out to communities, but going through trusted messengers so you can build that relationship, share information. And remember that first and foremost, you're there to learn from them because we all have a lot to learn from those communities and what are the solutions and what are the needs.
I have another question. I'm kind of morphing the kind of gist of what several questions here are, and that relates to economically disadvantaged communities by projects that actually provide economic benefit to the community by their existence. So whether it be some type of a factory, or whether it be some type of a processing plant, or whether it be an airport with a new user, there's economic, these projects are sold to local governments as being good for the local economy, but yet there doesn't seem to be any mechanism to direct the economic gain back to those populations that are more impacted by the activity itself, whatever it might be. Have you heard of any programs or any areas where there is targeted funding going to alleviate concerns, like whether it be helping with noise pollution or helping with better water quality or things like that, that link kind of that economic growth to minimizing impacts from an environmental justice perspective?
What you're asking, Robin, is a good question. And of course, funding is always the fun one, right? But I'm going to switch it up a little bit in linking economic gain to impact to unsuspecting communities. Now, the town of Stella, we know there is a significant PFAS contamination in the groundwater. The town has claimed that it is the result of land application of biosolids from a paper mill, an industry absolutely critical to Wisconsin's economy, right? Managing biosolids is essential to the process of that industry. Now, I'm not saying that this is a direct correlation. I'm just saying this is what is happening. So the paper mill finds a convenient method of taking care of an industrial byproduct that has some nutritive value for land application on soils. Farmers saw it as an opportunity, they took it. But the paper mill, the externalities, they've never paid the full cost of the impact of the pollution that they had the potential to emit in the form of the biosolids. Again, nobody did any, when this happened, no one was doing anything illegal. This was all legal. So in that thread of economic strength to finding convenient ways to manage things, and then unsuspecting communities, farmers not going to say, hey, can I see the the VOC profile on that biosolid, and what's the concentration of nitrogen versus phosphorus? They're not going to ask that. They saw it as a good opportunity. So to me, there is a thread there between people taking advantage of minimizing external cost of production and imposing them externally on other communities.
So
And
what's the
again, one more
solution?
disclaimer, I'm not saying that paper
Yeah.
mill did that. I
Yeah,
don't
I
want to
know,
get brought into a lawsuit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a good example, even hypothetically, of the kinds of things that we see. And I think the challenge is that it just takes so much money to rectify and remediate some of these situations that have been going on for a long time, even back before people knew that it was bad to be doing that. And I think that's the biggest challenge is it's kind of like this issue of, they weren't doing a bad practice at that time, they just didn't know the hazards. And so then there's a lot of angst about who's responsible for paying for that kind of situation.
I think if you want to extend that thread just a little bit further, as you saw from Julie's maps on the redlining and where we saw industries kind of thriving in the communities around them, which were typically minority communities, low-income communities, they worked at many of those facilities. Their livelihood was tied to it. So now you give them sort of the devil's choice, right? You can either put up with this in your neighboring community and have an income, or we'll close down and we'll move somewhere else, and now you don't have a job. So it's kind of like that family deciding on that whole house RO system. Shall we spend $3,000 or should we, I don't know, buy a car? We impose these terrible choices on people who have limited means or have been marginalized because of systems that have been in place for 100 years or more. So yeah, it's unfortunate.
I think what, Meleesa, what you bring up, I think goes to one point that I was going to bring up, Robin, related to your question, is that your answer, Meleesa, and the question, Robin, really highlights how all these systems are connected, right? And how environmental justice is so tied to other socioeconomic indicators as well. So one thing important to look out for is, this is why workforce protections are important. Workforce safety, employment protections, access to healthcare, if housing is involved, what kind of housing is being provided, but also, yes, the economic health of the worker themselves, their pay, what is that going to allow them to do for their family, for where they can choose to live, learn, and play. The other point I'll make, Robin, because you asked for examples, I think it's slowly starting to happen, but something to look for that I think is going to be more common is industry, as they're either building new or have renewed permits, are starting to do EJ screens. And I can describe what that is in a second for those that might not be familiar, and that as they identify that there might be EJ indicators in these different mapping tools that are available, that then they provide some sort of kind of, like you're saying, offset to that. And so that's encouraging in one sense, that industry is starting to acknowledge that that's going to be important and that people will place emphasis on it. But what we need to look for is, are those offsets that they're offering actually addressing the problem, right? So if it's a donation to a local school, that's great. Is that directly tied to the cumulative impact that's been identified through the EJ analysis? So an EJ screen, I'm realizing maybe some aren't familiar. So there's there's ability to do sort of what's sometimes called an EJ analysis through different mapping tools that are available. The EPA has one, the White House has one. EPA's is called EJ Screen. It's the most commonly used. And really, it's these amazing GIS mapping tools where you can layer different data on top of a map anywhere in the US, and you're able to see both socioeconomic indicators, but then a variety of environmental indicators so that you can really see geographically where different impacts are happening, and then you can identify areas where there's cumulative impact. So a community that's experiencing multiple environmental harms and hazards. And then also when you put on top of that some of the socioeconomic indicators that we talked about here that have cumulative impact, then those are identified as often what's termed disadvantaged communities or communities with environmental justice concerns.
So I had another question about this program is being hosted by the League of Women Voters, and as Jane said at the beginning, we are an advocacy organization. And one of the questions was asking whether or not there's state legislation that is going to be, shedding any light or providing any direction or assistance from an environmental justice perspective. Are there regulations, laws, programs that the league should be looking at and perhaps advocating for that would help not just spread the word, but help provide resources for addressing environmental justice issues systemically kind of throughout the state like that? So I know you talked about what we can do as individuals and what we can do locally. Are there more organizational type of things that we could do?
Well, I can answer just from DNR's perspective, and I'm not speaking to legislation generally, but just specifically as it relates to environmental justice. I will actually say that we don't necessarily need that much statutory change at this stage to be able to affect some of the changes that we want for environmental justice. What our agency does need is more capacity to do first all of our work so that we can be more responsive to the needs of the community, but then also so that we can do more outreach work and be on the ground with communities in a regional way that we're able to be more responsive. And so, yeah, I think for us, it's really more of a capacity issue at this stage for environmental justice that would really, because there is actually some flexibility already in the law where we can use the data specifically to affect change. But more importantly, at this stage, what our work is focused on is, looking at compliance statewide, where there might be disparities, engaging with those communities so that they're empowered to have the information they need. And then, that leads into all the other legislation around, environmental protection. But really, when we help support those empowered communities and learning more about that, then they're going to be better able to advocate for those environmental protection legislation that's so crucial to our management.
I'm going to circle it back to the local level after serving. This is the first year in 10 years that my name's not on a ballot. So I'm always thinking of the local level, and I'm very happy my name's not on a ballot. So my friends over at the Wisconsin Conservation Voters have launched a campaign to engage local village boards, city councils about getting climate targets, resolutions built into their ordinances. If we could see that same sort of effort around environmental justice, imagine communities across Wisconsin who now, when they start talking about changing their wellhead protection zoning, or talk about where their housing should be, or how they're going to redevelop an urban core, or redevelop a brownfield site. And now they also have to meet the environmental justice requirements of a new ordinance they have. That's the kind of activism at the local level that can change up right at the grassroots. Again, I'm a local activist person.
So are either of you aware of any kind of model ordinances that people could be looking at? Is there a link you could put in or do you know of any quick, like do a Google search on this and you might find it?
I will bet before I go to bed, I'm going to find something and send it to you. You can send it out to everybody.
Okay. All right. I think that would be great. I think that's a really good
That's a
idea.
good question. Do you know of
Yeah.
anything, Julie?
Well, no, not offhand. The only thing that's coming right now to mind, Meleesa, are you familiar with Wausau is the first community in Wisconsin to have an environmental justice, I don't know what they're calling it. It's not an ordinance, but
No, it's not.
I'm trying.
I think it's just like an advisory committee, isn't it?
Well, they have I'm trying to think of, like, it's a statement on environmental justice.
Right.
Like a resolution or something?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
An environmental justice resolution. And that's available online. And it's, I mean, it's naming very clearly that this is an important issue to them. And it kind of makes promises that they will consider inequities in their decision making. So that goes to all of our discussion around local decision making, zoning, etc.
Yeah. Can you imagine a TIF policy, so tax incremental financing district, that says not only we need to do this or due diligence related to the, what if, or therefore, but also add in anything related to the use of taxpayer dollars for the development and TIFs also have to include an examination of environmental justice. You just change the conversation. Everybody starts talking about changing the framing. That's how you change the framing.
Okay, great example.
I think, Robin, this is making me think too, in all our discussions about like what action can happen, legislation, etc. We don't necessarily talk enough, and this is actually key and something that we're going to be looking at the DNR is prioritization. That alone can make a significant impact. The lead line replacement projects in different communities is sort of an obvious, tangible example of, especially in a community in Milwaukee where they have so many and it's going to take many years, prioritizing the lead line replacement in the communities that need it most, right? Yeah. Again, that's a very tangible example. But other choices, other projects that local communities are looking at, are they prioritizing those projects that are going to benefit the communities who need it most? So just wanted to put that out there, that alone could actually affect a lot of change if you look more closely at the prioritization of where their economic development is going.
So, and I know because we're at 7:45, so I think we'll get a couple more questions in. I really appreciate your time, with us this evening and your generosity of your time as part of this discussion. It's really been a great discussion. So there have been several questions about kind of rural issues as it relates to environmental justice and perhaps a lot of questions, but focus on the siting of confined animal feeding operations, CAFO. I'm sorry, is it confined animal feeding operations, like CAFO? And a large animal operations.
And concentrated.
Concentrated, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I knew there was something wrong with how I was.
They're just big. They're big.
They're big. And then about nitrates, about the lack of groundwater standards for PFAS, it seems like there's the agricultural community as a whole is not as regulated from that perspective. And I personally don't envision a situation in which there's a lot more regulation coming down the pipe in terms of that. But how do you in rural areas address some of the exposures from unregulated sources? And how do you put that into an environmental justice lens, so to speak?
I wish I had an answer to that. We have a CAFO. I had mentioned the village of Nelsonville before I started coughing up a lung. disproportionately impacted nitrate contamination. There is an upstream CAFO. The DNR, through order, said there should be monitoring wells. They fought that order. And they continue to fight any sort of regulation indicating that, I mean, it's the mantra, we feed America, we feed the world. We should be able to do what we want. They have already sourced through DNA much of that contamination. And we need policymakers at the local level to actually do the work that the statute gives them the authority to do, to protect human health and the environment. And if they're not, I'm going to say it again, show up at meetings, be heard, run for office. Because right now we have folks in Nelsonville, half of the drinking water is undrinkable because of nitrate issues. This CAFO, because of the minimal regulation, will be able to continue doing what they're doing. It requires, unfortunately, countless hours, years of effort by grassroots activists to protect their lives, their property, and their investments. That's just, I wish it was different, Robin. I wish it was different.
And I think that, Julie, I don't know if you had anything to add to that or not.
Just that from our perspective, this is why, as far as my work, the focus on outreach and education for local communities to know what the issues are. Also, we're trying to expand our efforts with farmer-led groups, really working on that relationship building and partnership so that we're addressing these issues together. There are plenty of agricultural employers who I think of them as employers because of the migrant farm worker work, but who do want to do well. And so they want to be part of that conversation and motivating their neighbors to do the same. So that's focus.
Wisconsin's Greenfire just was awarded a Natural Resources Conservation Service grant, and we are going to be working with farmers on nitrogen sequestration rather than having it, number one, minimizing, it's called the Farm Reward Grant. I'm trying to remember. Farm Sustainability Reward Grant. And it is about, instead of using excessive amount of nitrogen, it's expensive. Let's figure out how to use less. Let's figure out how to do better land management. Let's figure out a system that can engage you. Let's solve the problem upstream so that my dear friend Lisa, who lives in Nelsonville, doesn't have to spend 24/7 trying to figure out how to protect her family.
Appreciate that. I wanted to, I've got a note here about, we were talking about PFAS and water contamination, and I want to recognize that the State League is doing a series of public webcasts that are going to be March 12th at 6:30 p.m. And if you visit the State League of Women Voters of Wisconsin website, you'll find postings for those. And I see, Meleesa, you're going to be one of the speakers along with Dr. Beth Neary, who is the co-president of Wisconsin Environmental Health Network. So just wanted to give a quick plug in and for them as well. Julie, there was a question, and I don't want to put you on the spot. And I know that you already mentioned the fact that one of the things that is a need is resources for DNR in particular, but for at very many levels to really start engaging on this topic. The question has come up as to what is your ability to help with people who have questions in the public? Are you a resource for them? I know that you're very busy, and I'm really grateful to have your time. And obviously, people are seeing your name and they're seeing your presentation. Are you available for inquiries, brief inquiries from people? How like is it okay for people to reach out and contact you?
So of course, people should feel free to contact me. I have to be so careful with my time because I should also mention, if people aren't aware already, like we are surrounded by states who are leading in this work, and that we're so fortunate to be in that position, at least, even if we don't necessarily have the resources that we'd like to compared to them. So Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, their environmental protection agencies have entire offices devoted to environmental justice. They have full staff. When I'm on those EPA calls with the fellow EJ coordinators, they say, well, in our Office of Environmental Justice, this is the work we're, and I'm like, I am the Office of Environmental Justice at DNR. And so that's been an incredible challenge. And I've had to be extremely strategic in the work I'm doing internally and externally because of that issue of prioritization, like where can we make the best change? And really it's building capacity of our staff to do it. Like it's not me doing the work, it's our staff, of course, but how can I empower our agency and our partners to do this work? So the answer is, of course, people can feel free to reach out. If it's a project that's not DNR related, I'm not here obviously as a consultant but if it is DNR related and there's an issue in a community, absolutely, we're wanting to learn more about those issues on the ground level that are impacting different communities that maybe we haven't been as in tune with as we want to. We definitely want to make that change. And it's slow because we don't have dedicated staff to this, but we're finding ways to build that capacity. And a lot of it is going to happen with external partnerships, right? Those groups like Walnut Way, like the Hmong and Hispanic Communications Network, who we can, they can be a liaison in some ways to do that work. So yes, feel free to reach out if it's DNR related. Maybe this will be our next pilot project. But it's a constant kind of balance of how to balance this time.
All right. I'm just going to scroll through. I think we've got a few more. Okay, we're good. So I'm wondering if I can do an ask as we close this program up today, an ask of both of Meleesa and Julie. If you would be willing to send me perhaps some websites or links for resources that you think our audience would like. I have email addresses for all the registrants, and I would be happy to send those out to people as a follow-up communication. And so it might take a little while given kind of workloads for everybody, but I think if you could send me some things within the next week or two, then within the next 2 or 3 weeks, I would try to get something pulled together just so people can have some solid kind of other contacts and way to move forward. Does that sound good?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we want to do too is engage our local leagues to start taking, and they can serve as conduits, right?
Oh, absolutely.
They're in our communities and they can serve as the conduit for some of that grassroots organizing around this very topic. I say that as a league member. So Stevens Point area, just saying.
Well, thank you. I want to express my personal thanks to you and also to the people who have registered. I think I'm going to turn it over to Jane to make some closing statements, but really this was so informative, and obviously we had great turnout and great interest in this topic. And again, thank you so much. Jane, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
There we go. Thank you very much, Julie and Meleesa, for bringing this great wealth of information. It's really opened my eyes to, oh, I was thinking environmental justice. I was just thinking PFAS and airports, but that's way more than that. So thank you for bringing this to us. I think at the local league, I think of Observer Corps in the local leagues where we observe the local community government meetings, that can be informational for our local leagues, and then our programming during the year for highlighting some of this information. So lots of good information here. I wanted to thank then all the leagues that have been co-hosts this evening. and also the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin for developing a system where the local leagues can share broader topics for the whole state to be involved. I think this has been a good example of the statewide networking that we are privileged to have. And thank you, Robin, for knowing about the topic and bringing this program to fruition, and along with our program committee locally. I want to make sure that everybody watching has a plan for voting on April 2nd, of course. We're all about voting. And so also then look at vote411.org to look up your candidates and information on the ballots so you're a good informed voter. Thank you to everybody that joined in this evening. I wanted to mention that in the La Crosse area, our next program is March 5th at the University of La Crosse, and we're going to be celebrating International Women's Day. And then April 10th, we're going to be happy to be out at the Mississippi Valley Refuge, where we're going to be celebrating joint centennials. So they've been in existence for 100 years, protecting wildlife in the Mississippi River Valley. And we've been in La Crosse for 100 years as a League of Women Voters starting in 1924. So we're really looking forward to that celebration. If you'd like to know more about those programs, you can look at our website, lwvlacrosse.org, for more information. So with all that, thank you again. It's been a great program, opened our eyes to lots of information. Environmental justice means a lot more to me now than it ever did before. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.